talking about user testing in the new normal, and we are calling it building better apps faster with early behavioral insights. So on the call today, you have me, George Abraham. I'm a senior product owner and UX principal at Infogistics. I'm also joined by Jason Barris. He's a senior VP of our developer tools, aka my boss. And we are here to talk about this user testing and what Indigo.Design has to offer in addressing this particular need. So before I kind of go deeper into user testing in this new normal, I just want to clarify and clear the air about certain concepts and how I see them, because that'll help me situate what I'm going to show you later on. So one of the first ones, and the very simple one, is what is design? And to me, design is this also, which is things which are nice and pretty, they're visually appealing, they have a lot of science actually behind creating these kind of lovely mosaics and Moroccan plates, if I'm not mistaken. But for me, the design, or at least the design I'm referring to, is designing for use, right? And that's what I make it a little different in terms of interactive systems, is that it's not just about something you need to look at, which is why I have this graphic about less presenting, and the attached graphic on the right says more using, because presenting your designs is not the same as using it. And that is one of the most critical or unique aspects of interactive systems, is that the systems we are actually designing, the software we are designing, they are actually meant for somebody to actually touch and use over time. And it's not just for something for them to look at. The other broad question, which I usually hate answering, is what is user experience, right? So there are a lot of memes you would find on LinkedIn or any other platform you go. Like, what is UI versus UX? What is usability versus user experience? And this debate kind of keeps morphing and adds new definitions all the time. So let me define it in my situation here. So for me, user experience is basically the combination when four of these things come together. And these four things are people, context, a task or a goal, and design, which is your solution. And the image you're seeing in the background is basically pretty directly inspired from an image I saw with on a Bill Buxton talk. And he has a book out there called Sketching User Experiences. And he really highlighted it in a very succinct way, is that what you're seeing on the left, this little CAD like drawing of the bicycle with all its dimensions mentioned, its properties mentioned, that stuff is talking about what we have as a solution. The experience actually happens in the moment, and the moment is when somebody is actually riding that particular bike in that kind of an area and having fun. And that is the kind of an experience which we are trying to design for, right? So that is the basic difference between how I'm seeing UX. And the reason I'm bringing it up, because I'll touch upon this again when we talk about usability, right? Which is one part of the user testing which we can support. Now, everybody is also familiar with this kind of a very simplistic representation, which everybody starts liking simple nowadays, of how software gets made, right? And in a very rough sense, it's this whole process of ideation, and this ideation is a very broad term here. It also includes research. It includes your persona development, your scenario investigation, and trying to figure out what are the high priority scenarios you're actually trying to address for. Then the next phase of this is what we call the prototyping phase. It's where we are trying to come up with these solutions. You're picking some of the alternatives you have kind of decided as potential answers to the problem, and you're actually building them into tangible form. Right after that, you have this learn phase, which is what we are talking about, the user testing in the new normal. Because in order for us to make software which people are with, or software that's meant for people, unless we are able to include them very early in this design process, it is it is not going to be this human-centric design process we are all touting, right? And if you look at this image I've been using, in a very rough depiction, I'm saying the prototype is like a couch you're trying to design, or a seat or a chair you're designing, and it is very well defined and designed, but unless somebody actually sits on it, we really wouldn't know whether it's comfortable or not, right? And that's where the user experience is also kicking in, right? Like the user has to be there in order for us to talk about user experience. So the part I'm not going to go too much into detail is this notion of what is a prototype, but I will touch upon it very briefly, because we need something, we need some form of a solution in order for us to actually test it with users, right? So in that vein, having a rough definition of what I meant by prototype and what the scope of it is important. So when we actually have to create these kind of prototypes, this is like a broader presentation I had done in the past. I'm not going to talk about it here, but let me say that medium fidelity, it strikes a very good balance between what we're trying to achieve, right? And by medium fidelity, it means that from a design perspective, in terms of the effort we invest, it has certain parameters uh, prioritized in the designs we're creating. The first is people are pretty crazy about creating very high fidelity mockups using high fidelity tools, which is fine, right? If it's very easy and very fast for you to do it, uh, it is great that you're able to produce it in a very short amount of time. And with design systems and with standardized design guidelines, most people kind of tend to lean towards creating something like that. But all I'm saying here is you do not need that in order for you to test quickly, right? So if somebody is in a phase of a project where you're trying to collect feedback from people, you do not have to worry that it's not a pixel perfect stuff. Because in fact, the fact that it's not pixel perfect may actually work in your advantage, where people are more amenable to give you feedback about that particular design. So let me just break down what you're seeing here on this particular slide. The first attribute I'm talking about is this notion of contrast, right? And without going into the slides for this, contrast here is basically saying that you do not actually need a full-on color palette. As long as you're using shades of gray in order to highlight sections of your UI, you are fine. The second part of it is what I'm calling hierarchy. And this is very simply the using type scale to define what is a header, what is a subheader, and what's the body text, so that when people are scanning this UI, reading content in your UI, they can very quickly make sense of what the structure of that information is. And then we have signifiers, which are like things like your buttons, your verb driven links, like click here, click there. This button is disabled, this button is enabled, this is the primary action button. Those are the signifiers. And then we have, even though I'm calling it medium fidelity, I'm talking about adding content which is relevant for your users, right? So when you say content relevant to your users, it means that if somebody is going to perform a meaningful task with your design or tools, then you should be providing enough content for them to make sense for it. Then there's stuff on the bottom around transitions. I'm not going to go into much. Same thing with white space. It's kind of obvious what it means. And I want to focus on the last two, which is something which is a big challenge faced by a lot of people when they have to get ready to create designs meant for testing. One is this notion of scale or scope. And the word scale could actually imply a physical scale, which means that you're designing for a specific form factor. So it could be a phone, it could be a desktop. And it's important for you to kind of create your tests or create your designs which you are going to test for those specific target platforms. Scope is talking about how much of this app are you going to model for your test, right? And the advice I have for you is, if you have come up with what is it that you're going to learn in terms of your usability test or your user test, you should be able to basically create your designs and prototypes to match that particular script, right? Because anything outside the bounds of that script, it is valuable from a design exploration perspective, but it's not critical for us to actually conduct a testing with users. And finally, most importantly, task flow. As I said earlier, when I first started this presentation, this whole notion of usability or user testing is not about looking at something, it's about using something. And in order for somebody to use it, it needs to represent and support the steps somebody needs to take in order to complete that particular task, right? So task flow is absolutely critical in whatever design you end up creating. Oops. And this is what I call my medium fidelity prototype, which is something in the middle, right? And I'm showing you the two extremes which could take place. On the very right, there's a design which looks almost created using a high fidelity design tool. It has colors, it has all the details. And on the extreme left, it's my sketch, right? It's representing the same thing. It has the same amount of content added to it, right? So it's not skimping on that aspect of it, but it's hand-drawn. And there's nothing wrong with the first one, only that it takes me way longer, at least me personally, way longer to end up creating all the different states of the UI I might have to end up creating in order to support a user story. And this is the other thing I actually stole from being inspired from Bill Buxton, is that there is whatever fidelity your prototype is in, whether it's low fidelity, high fidelity, it should always support a high fidelity experience. And what that means is that we actually need people to lose themselves in trying to accomplish a task, be focused on that task they're completing. And the medium, like how, whether it's sketched or whether it's wireframed, it doesn't really as much matter as long as you're actually holding true to the principles I was just talking about, is that the content is legit, there is type scale, there is a flow, and the interactive elements are obvious. Then people would be able to use even the more rough looking design and still give us the feedback we're looking for. So I talk about this topic in a little bit more detail, which is available in that link you see on the bottom here. It's bit.ly/story of use. And you can actually see a little bit more detailed discussion of what I meant by fidelity. So now that we cleared up what is design, we cleared up what I'm thinking about in terms of user experience. Now let's talk about what is usability testing. It looks like a boring term from yesteryears. Nobody likes to call it usability testing nowadays. Everybody likes to call it user testing. But essentially, the only difference I need everybody to remember is that it's not the same as user acceptance testing, right? Because user acceptance testing can be more geared towards functional testing, whereas usability testing is trying to figure out whether somebody is able to use it, without help and able to figure it out on their own. So if I had to create the UX version of a Maslow's hierarchy, the pyramid would pretty much look like this, where on the bottom level, we have this notion of useful. And useful is basically saying, why does this product even exist, right? It's stuff which is coming out of your research, stuff which you have actually figured out as being important for your target audience, and that's what you're trying to build. Usability is basically just talking about the effectiveness of that solution which you have come up with in order to solve that problem identified in the usefulness phase. And then finally, you have desirability, where you are trying to have a more emotional connection with the product you have designed. Now, one big caveat, even though I'm drawing it like a pyramid which has got separate sections, it is not true that all of the usefulness have to be met before people start thinking about usability, or all of the usability have to be met before people think about desirability. That is not exactly true, because people have thresholds, right? So you need to pass a basic threshold of usefulness, before we even can talk about usability, right? Because there's no point in creating something which works very simple to use, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, right? It's kind of meaningless, right? So that's where I wanted to kind of highlight here, is that even though we are doing testing with users on doing a usability test, let's not oversell its contribution, because at the end of the day, usability is only part of the UX layer cake. So let me think about a example which is nothing to do with software. Say that you're designing a chainsaw, right? And you have been ideating around it. You have kind of figured out all the choices you have to make in order to build a very stable, lightweight, powerful chainsaw, right? And that is your solution to the problem. Usability testing is literally this, right? Can it be used to perform the task it was designed for, right? And that's what usability test always talks about, representative tasks, right? So if it's a chainsaw, does it cut a tree, right? And then there's one more part to it. In order for us to do a valid or useful testing with user session, you need to ask yourself, are you targeting representative people, right? So there's representative tasks done by representative people, and that basically constitutes what a user test should really be like. So while the chainsaw can be used in a very alternate context, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Evil Dead, but that's a potential use for a chainsaw. But the question you have to ask is that what you designed this for? Or is it really for something to be used by professionals, like the person in this picture here? They seem to have all the protective gear and protective equipment. My goal is not to give this chainsaw to my kid to see whether he can, cut something. Right? We really want the right kind of people giving you feedback for this. And the reason I took this kind of an extreme example of designing a chainsaw to situate usability testing is that imagine the benefits we have in the software world in order to test with primitives. What I mean by testing with early artifacts. Whereas in this case, in order for me to cut down that tree, I actually have to make something of a legitimate chainsaw, right? In order for that to work. I'm sure they also have prototyping processes in the engineering industry. So they have other ways to do it. I'm not familiar with it, but I was just using it as a contrast to talk about in software. We actually have these kind of intermediate artifacts which we create, designs, sketches, low fidelity designs, and not testing those designs early with users, we are actually giving up a lot, right? And we are actually not de-risking development if we are postponing this effort till the software is actually built out. Now, admittedly, there are things in the software, there are certain things in the software which need to be actually coded up before you can test it. But at the same time, there are a lot of things in the software which could be tested upfront, without actually going through this, um, without skipping it altogether. So that's where this usability testing is, right? And going back to the graphic I was showing you earlier, it's the point in time when designing a chair, you're sitting on it, right? And I gave a chainsaw example just to give another extreme scenario. So now that I've focused your attention on user testing, there are three kinds of trade-offs we also need to make in order to be effective, right? Because at the end of the day, if this is going to take us a lot of time, people are going to drag their feet, it's going to get expensive, and then it's not going to fit your agile life cycle, right? Which actually creates more risk, both for the professional who you have hired to do these kind of things, and also for the team because they don't have the insights to work on. So the first trade-off you need to figure out is between moderated and unmoderated, right? And most people might be familiar with it, but let me just highlight it here. So there are two ways in which I can do testing with users. The basic one is moderated, and the moderated setup is such that there is a organizer or a moderator who is present, and they actually conduct these user sessions one-on-one with these participants, right? And that's what it means by the word moderated. In the unmoderated setup, what it's trying to do in the most general sense is that there is nobody present. The user is able to come in, they can start taking part in this user test on their own without actually waiting for anybody to start this test or whatever. So to quickly score them based on how effective they are, it depends on what your situation is, right? So if you have no knowledge of the domain you're working in and you are really trying to learn and want to understand why, it is likely that a moderated session might help you out, right? Because you have the opportunity to persuade, to ask, and prod the user as they're performing these kind of tasks. In an unmoderated setting, it is also possible, like we use the think aloud protocol, they can also do these things. They can record what they are thinking, they can capture their face camera, but at the same time, once people get into the busy with things, sometimes they forget, and it's difficult to to help them come back to think out loud. The next thing is all about observing participants. So if you want to actually conduct a test in a certain situation, and this particular person, say that you're observing a doctor or you're observing a financial trader, in that kind of a setting, having that one-on-one connection is important, because both the number of users who are available to you in order for you to do these kind of studies, they are few, and you would like to learn as much as possible from them. So moderated, again, kind of scores a little better than unmoderated. Then if you look into the whole logistics game, and now the fact that we are all remote, the first two scenarios are getting increasingly difficult, right? So you can do a third aspect of this. This is like whether it's a remote or in person, right? You can have remote moderated, remote unmoderated. And in this case, people are opting more for the remote unmoderated. But even if you do for the remote moderated, where you're using some kind of a Zoom call in order to make a communication or connection with your participant, you still need moderator as a resource, right? And if any of your areas does not require this kind of a highly specialized kind of scenarios, they are more mid-level, right? So it's easy to talk about the extremes, whereas on one end you have walk up and use kind of UIs like a kiosk, it could be facebook.com, and on the other end we have highly specialized application. Maybe you're designing the UI for remote surgeries, right? Like the surgeon is sitting in front of the computer and they are operating on you laparoscopically or something. I don't know. Now, these are the extreme scenarios, but there's a lot of software being built which don't fit these extremes, right? Where you have somewhat specialized audiences, somewhat generalizable tasks, and you're trying to find a way to quickly collect that kind of a feedback for the designs you're coming up with. So in that kind of a scenario, moderator as a resource becomes a bottleneck, right? So if you have only so many moderators available to conduct these studies, then the number of tests you can do reduces drastically. And that in turn starts affecting this notion of how quickly can you scale up the study. I'm not saying that you always need to run studies of 500 people before you can make a design decision, because it will depend on what kind of an effect you're kind of trying to study. If it's something with saying that we need to be sure that creating this new design versus the old design uh, should not change the task performance time more than 0.1 second. If you're looking for something that fine and granular, you may actually have to study with a lot more people. A few people is not going to sell that scenario. But even in those situations, the option or the opportunity to scale it up from, hey, you tested with 10 people, then you want to test with another 10 people, another 10 people. That kind of a process is way easier in these kind of unmoderated usability testing tools. Then there's task metrics. Task metrics is literally talking about these time on task, or what kind of click or misclick information they had, whether the people got stuck somewhere. How do you kind of bubble this up information automatically without actually having to physically take notes or review these kind of sessions separately? Then we have the time for setup and feedback. So this becomes huge, because if you have done this kind of a user test before, it takes a long time to sometimes coordinate all these sessions and make sure that people and keep up with cancellation requests or rescheduling requests. With a remote kind of a scenario, it wins more brownie points here, is because it's already set up. You just send a link to someone and they can actually take part. And then finally is this notion of extracting patterns, which is, I think, very critical. Is that sometimes you are looking for issues faced by specific people, but at the same time, you're also looking for a pattern of issues, right? You want to see that whether multiple people are having issues at the same times in order to kind of prioritize your design effort. The second thing you need to understand in terms of trade-offs is there's a difference between prototyping the entire app versus prototyping prioritized stories, right? And if you look at an example from the movie industry, you see the set, out here, and there's a camera, I'm sure somewhere, maybe here, and only what the camera sees is well finished. Everything else is literally a set, and there is no reason why we can't build software UIs using the same process, where we're only concerned about creating designs and screens which belong to a user task or a task we are willing to test. Everything else falls on the wayside. We'll tackle it later. And so you do not actually have to design everything. Instead, you can just focus on prioritized story. And the benefit of that is instead of trying to create a mega study, because as you run into even the moderated or the unmoderated setup, there is only so much attention span participants have for you, and they can do maybe 5 or 10 things for you. You cannot use them to test everything. So sometimes you may have to have a strategy where you're bundling certain tasks together and then sending that set to a different audience and another set to another audience so that you're able to get coverage. So 30 people are testing tasks 1, 3, and 5. Another 20 people are testing tasks 2, 4, and 6. So you're able to have that kind of a creative freedom. And it's also a very strategic and a clever way in order for you to kind of scale up your design capabilities. And the third trade-off, which is it's the one I've heard uh, people complain about a little bit, is this whole notion of personalized versus aggregated feedback. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the definition of a user story, which I personally despise from Agile, because story had such a rich meaning, and in the Agile world, it becomes this kind of a robotic. As a biz dev as associate, I want to set limits for business expenses. Basically, you get the gist, right? So that's pretty much how a user story gets actually written up. And when you want to test this kind of a scenario, yes, I would love that you're able to go in and say, you know what, why don't you try setting budget or expenses for this finance app? Go ahead, do whatever you like to do as long as you finish this task. Now, when you do that approach, it's okay to do it if you have a coded application, but when you're doing a preliminary or initial designs, you it's okay for you to focus everybody to do a specific task, right? So instead of giving this elaborate user story where you can set limits for any business expense and figure out how much is safe to send, you can basically say, hey, your task is to change the budget for coffee to $65, right? Now, with this approach, the benefit we get is like, say that you tested with 10 people. All 10 people will try to do the same things. And you would actually get a very quick idea in aggregate whether there are issues or problems faced by these particular users, right? So this trade-off is okay to make early in your design process so that you can actually come up with these aggregate patterns quickly. So with that, let's do a quick demo mode for this particular presentation, right? We are almost at the halfway mark for this webinar. So what I want you to do is take 5 minutes. I'm going to run the timer here. Take part in a user test, right? And we will see what kind of results actually come in. So you get a first-hand sense of what Indigo.Design can offer in terms of this remote user testing um, area. If you want to take part, all you need to do is open up your browser. Chrome is preferable because Chrome gives us some extra, which I can show you later. But go ahead and type in bit.ly/participate -sample1. And that would actually start showing off what it looks like when you take part in a user test on Indigo.Design. And while you're doing that, I'm going to pull up what it looks like on my end so that you can actually also watch how this session actually happens. So I'm going to copy the same URL and go here, and I go bit.ly participate sample1. And most probably I might have already done this test, so it'll prevent me from taking part again. Yep, that's the case. That's okay. I'm just gonna pull up an incognito session. And this is the kind of experience you're going to see, right? And I'm showing you the participation experience because it's the easiest experience for you to try sitting where you are. And then I'm going to show you how somebody would set up a user test on Indigo.Design and also show you the kind of results and reporting it has to offer. So the moment you land in here, you're going to be invited with some text. And this text is something which you control as an organizer when you set up this user test. And when you hit continue, because I'm using Chrome, it invites you to actually install a extension. And this extension allows us to actually capture this exact browser session you're running. So everything under this browser, we'll be able to capture as a video recording. And if you enable your microphone and camera, which you have the option to from the extension itself, you can actually record your voice and also share your FaceTime camera while you take part in this test. So if you start the test without this, you'll start seeing tasks being presented one at a time. And this is an excellent way for even doing reviews with your stakeholders. I know it's kind of an extreme proposal here, but most of the times as designers, the struggle has been that when you go into a meeting room to do a presentation, you start opinions flying very quickly. And when we actually send a potential link or a potential stakeholder to review a link for a prototype, they go in there, but unless we can provide them some context, some guidance, they would end up clicking everywhere possible and get frustrated because the design is not matching what they thought or how it should work. Instead, if we send them to a user test, the context is there. They will be able to both experience the app as you have designed it, try to do something meaningful. You give you those kind of behavioral insights in addition to their opinions, right? So that actually gives us, it's like a two birds with one stone kind of a policy here. So in this case, it's saying create an expense category for auto with a limit of $500. And this was like an example of a finance app. I'm showing you mobile just because it's easier to show right now, but you can of course run user testing for desktop applications, your websites, doesn't matter because however big your browser can go, that's how big the test would be. So if I start this task, it pretty much loads up the design, and that's my task, create an expense category, and I have to figure out where I would go in order to complete this particular task. So I can fudge around, I can explore. Nope, nothing here. It's not this one. I'll go here. It's budget. I open this up. Okay. Okay, new expense type, auto, create an expense. And when I'm done with that, now this is the exact time for us to provide these opinions. It's like, okay, that happened really fast and I could not remember. And this is okay because then you can always go back and ask them to now review it in an ad hoc way, right? They don't actually need to do user testing, but you got your data, which is the excellent part. So when you go to the next task, it serves up the second task in this pipeline. And these tasks are being randomized. And I'll show you how it looks like when you set up a user test on Indigo.Design. So you have this task 2 of 2, change budget to coffee. You can start that task. And if somebody is stuck, they can hit the guide me action and it'll kind of highlight where somebody needs to click in order to not quit the task altogether, but at least try to complete this task in so that we can move on to task number 3, task number 4 and something. But if you are very adamant about it, you can say, yep, I'm going to skip everything, which is okay for now. And at the very end, you would be basically saying that everything is done. You've completed all tasks, right? So now that you've seen what the participation experience looks like, and this is mobile friendly, so you can actually take part in for this particular test, you can run it on your phone, you can run it on your tablet. So as long as you have access to a web browser, you're good to go. So let me show you what it looks like in terms of setting up this particular test, right? So what you're seeing here is Indigo.Design. And Indigo.Design is the place where all these projects live, right? And you can create projects directly in here because in order to do a user test, you actually need a design for you to test. And you can do that publishing of the designs in 2 ways. So when I create a new prototype, you can see that on the invitation, it says if you're using Sketch, you can install a plugin and then you can publish designs directly into the cloud with all the navigations, the interactions present. Browse my files. go to my downloads, get these images in here, open, and then I can just upload those images which I've created using whatever visual editor you need. It's adding all the images right now. And I can actually set up my basic workflows directly in the cloud, right? So I don't actually need a third-party tool in order to do this. So I can just say, you know what, drag to create a hotspot. You can create a link saying go to this screen. From here, go to another screen, and so on and so forth, right? So you can quickly create these kind of navigation flows which are relevant for the user test you're looking to conduct, right? So let me just call it webinar sample. Yep, that's good. So once you have a design of this kind, every workspace, so I call it workspace because these are designs which I have running in my prototype area. But you can also have a collaboration area or a cloud area where you can have multiple people running these kind of tests. So I can come in here, and this is the design I was working on. And right here, I can just say create a new usability test based on this particular design. And now what you're seeing is this test setup area, right? So now I can say, you know what? I'm going to create two quick tasks. I'm going to say order a new ride. And along with that, I'm going to define what is the expected success path. And as the tool says, use the prototype to complete the task, and we'll record the steps. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to get sign in, request a ride, confirm. And you can see there are 4 steps which automatically get recorded as part of that particular task. I can add another task. I can say finish the ride. I'll say, okay, finish the ride. I don't want to start here. Pick a different start point. I'll say start it here and then start recording. Finish. I make a mistake. No problem. I can just undo it, start again, submit. And now I have 2 nice little tasks which I would like to test. Switch over to test settings. And this is where you can change the welcome message I was showing you earlier, where you can actually say what you want to, how do you want to set the stage for your participants, introduce your project, talk to them about what they can see or what they can expect. And then there's a thank you message. If you want them to take some additional actions after they finish everything, when all the 2 tasks which I've defined are completed, they can actually continue with this process. So I am fine. I'm going to randomize 2 tasks, which makes no sense, but I'm going to do it anyway. Go back to tasks. And then once I'm ready, I'll just hit start testing. And then my test is ready to go. So this is the link to participate. If I send it to someone, they would see the very same experience I was showing you when I was showing you the participation experience. And that's why I showed you that experience first. I don't know how many of you took the opportunity to take part in that test yourself, but I'm just going to pull up the URL once again, just so that you can see. So that was bit.ly/participate-sample1, right? So if you guys are still taking part, good to go. But now let me show you what results look like for Indigo.Design for these kind of remote user tests. So let's see, go back to my cloud here. So I'm going to switch over to a project area which actually has participations so that I can show you what it looks like once there are enough people taking part. So just like prototypes are all the designs you ended up creating using our editor or publishing from scratch, we have another section here for all the usability tests which are running right now. So in here, I have 3 tests in progress. This has only 1 participation, and this one has 7 with a 75% success rate. Let's look at this one. And now what you're seeing is the third part of our usability testing capability is our reporting, right? And the whole idea of reporting is to help you generate, identify bottlenecks in your design very quickly, irrespective of how many people took part, right? So if 30 people took part and you want to quickly get a sense of where things are going wrong, we would like to make it easy for you to do that. And that's how the whole report is designed. On the left, you have all the high-level analytics. On the right side, it's broken up into 2 zones. The first zone is showing you a completion funnel. And the funnel you're seeing here is the exact expected success path you set up when you were creating this user test, right? On top of the completion funnel, you're seeing are interaction markers. If you look at the legend tells us the blue markers are the expected interactions, the red diamonds are unexpected, right? And it's only showing us the first click. So it's also doubling as the first click report, right? So of the 7 people who came into this funnel, you can see very early on they start clicking outside where you expected them to click early on, and then 5 people, 2 people veered off this expected path, and 5 people continued, right? So you can see a very aggregate representation. The second zone in this panel is our user segment report, and the user segmentation is happening automatically. It's creating groups based on whether people used the expected path, whether people used an alternate success path, which means that they reached the last step somehow, right? They started on the first step, they took the scenic route, and they ended up on the final step, which is okay, which is why we are automatically categorizing them as an alternate success path. And 2 of the 7 people used um, a path which did not actually lead to completion, right? And on the bottom here is actually showing you a visualization of the person's timeline, right? So it is less interesting for people who use the expected success path, but for people who used a failed path, it lights up much better, where you can see very quickly that where the issues were happening. So you can say that they started off okay, and I can just hover on these interaction markers to see a preview of where they actually click and what UI state they were on. And I can see, oh, okay, all right, they're clicking somewhere else, somewhere else. And the benefit of that Chrome extension, which I talked about earlier, is that I have 2 ways to look at a person's journey, right? So if I'm now ready to kind of take a deeper dive. And the way I would typically advise people to triage is scan the list of tasks, find the ones which has the poorest success rate. So this one has 57%. Let's check that out first. And once I select that one, I would say, let's look at the people who failed and look at the failed paths to see, okay, so this one was just chaos. Like from the get-go, people were misclicking. They were clicking things which we did not expect. This orange marker is actually showing you that they actually requested guidance, which would automatically classify them as somebody who used the failed path, because we don't want people to use the cheat codes and still figure it out and mark that as success. We don't want that. But if this is not your cup of tea, you can always click on view path. Let me do on this one because this one also has a video. And now it's actually showing you that particular user's journey. Now you're seeing all the interaction markers overlaid on top of the UI state. So you can actually very quickly get a sense of where they are clicking around on that particular UI. If I go into something different here, it's also showing you for this particular screen, I can see that the sequence in which they actually clicked. So this one was a tap interaction, then they tapped there, then they tapped on the title. So pretty much all over the board, right? And if this format is not working out for you, and the reason we still created a rich way of creating these kind of static reports is that now it is possible that people are not able to provide you video for some reason. But even if they don't provide you video, we wanted to make sure that you have insights you can actually aggregate very quickly, right? But this person actually provided a video. I can just switch over to video replay, and now you can see a session replay of that particular participant's session. And I can just quickly scrub. I don't actually have to watch in real time. I can speed up this video to 8x the speed, or I can jump straight to the portions where I can see where they were having issues. You can always go full screen in this modal, but that allows me to quickly see where the issues were, when they asked for guidance, and see that user session as if they were performing it in front of me, right? So the video replay capabilities provides us another level of information. So to summarize, the usability, the user test report area is really meant not to help you get lost, but to quickly generate issues early, right? So you can immediately triage what the issues are as quickly as possible. So what I showed you right now, I talked about how to take part in a user test. I went through how you can set up a user test using Indigo.Design. Then I talked about how do you take or extract information from the user test report very quickly. And that brings us towards the end of our presentation, where I just want to reiterate that in order for you to create designs which you can test, you does not need to be this super polished UI. It just needs to make sure that from a visual perspective, it's a medium fidelity kind of designs which prioritizes contrast for the UI zones, hierarchy for the type scale, a consistent visual language for signifiers, content that's meaningful. Transitions are, of course, optional. White space is just to declutter the UI. And more importantly, the notion of targeting prototyping efforts and testing efforts in the notion of physical scale, like whether you're designing for a phone, tablet, or desktop, or from a scope perspective. That's another way of thinking about scale, is how many user stories is captured in this particular usability test. And then finally, ensuring that you are testing tasks. That means that it's a task flow and not just static screens which somebody would test for. The second thing I wanted to loop back on is understand that you're still making some trade-offs in order to learn quickly. And the recommendation for me is between moderated and unmoderated. There are many scenarios where unmoderated would win, and then there are scenarios where moderated win. For me, the basic differentiator is if the users or the people you're trying to test with, they are very few in number or very specialized. To be honest, moderated would work out better. But there are a lot of scenarios where none of those criteria would matter. You would have access to maybe not 500 people, but you would have access to 10, 15, 20. Unmoderated would win in the flexibility it offers. And you can speed up this whole design process by focusing on prioritized stories and not trying to redesign or mimic the entire app in one shot. And finally, focusing people on specific things or specific tasks is not bad because it allows you to aggregate the user's participation and collect these kind of reports such that you can see the pattern of usage across applications. If I went through the user testing part in terms of Indigo.Design really quickly, have no fear. You can always check out there's a playlist we have created on YouTube. You can get to it directly right now with bit.ly/indigo-user-testing. And that basically summarizes the 3 stages I was showing you here with setting up, taking part, and then reviewing this user test results. So we are towards the end, and I'm going to just quickly see